where constraints may be in the form of inequality, where the constraints may be in the form of inequality. Constraints may be in the form of inequality. What are the inequalities? It may be less than or equal to, or it may be equal to, or it may be greater than or equal to. Any three, one of the signs. Fine. Even in the form of equal to. And finally satisfy non-negative restrictions. And finally satisfy non-negative restrictions. Very important it is. Non-negative restriction, that is x1 is greater than or equal to 0, x2 is greater than or equal to 0, in the same way x3 is greater than or equal to 0, and so on. xn is greater than or equal to 0. This is equation number 3. So let us have a small repetition of this one. So the general formulation of LPP is nothing but in order to find the value of n decision variables such as x1, x2, x3 up to xn with respect to the objective function, whether it is to be maximized or minimized. Fine. So this is a general formulation of LPP, that is z is equal to c1x1 plus c2x2 plus c3x3 plus up to cn xn, which is equation number 1, and also satisfy you m constraints. What are those constraints? Here it is constraints a11 x1, a12 x2, a13 x3, and so on. These are what constraints. These type of equations we have already dealt in numerical and statistical methods subject, which is there for second semester. Fine. In second chapter we have Gauss elimination, Gauss Jordan, Gauss Seidel, where we have solved system of linear equations using Gauss elimination, Gauss Jordan, Gauss Jacobi. Fine. We have used these equations only to solve. In the form of matrix we have solved them. But whereas here we are supposed to solve these linear equations using linear programming problem. Fine. So there are two types of formulations of linear programming problem. First one is mathematical formulation of LPP, whereas the second one is general formulation of LPP. Fine. So thank you for the day. Thank you very much. Good morning, students. So in this class we are going to deal with how to formulate LPP. Fine. How to formulate the LPP. There are two steps to formulate the LPP. The first one is mathematical formulation and second one is general formulation. So there are two things in formulating LPP. The first one is mathematical formulation, whereas the second one is general formulation of LPP. So we will deal with the first one, that is mathematical formulation of LPP. So it contains the following steps. Fine. The mathematical formulation of LPP contains the following steps. That is step number 1, what it contains. So step number 1 contains to write down the decision variables of the problem. So first of all we have to suppose to write the decision variables of the problem. Fine. Write down the decision variables of the problem. Fine. Then comes to the step 2 here. To formulate the objective function, once we have finished with the step 1, that is writing down the decision variables, in step 2 we need to formulate the objective function. So formulate the objective objective function. So how to formulate the objective function? So objective function can be maximized or minimized according to the need. Fine. If it is in case of a profit, or in case of a sales, we need maximized sale or maximum sale. If it is in case of resource allocation, then loss, we need to minimize the objective function. These are the small examples that I have given. Fine. So we need to formulate the objective function, whether it will be maximized or minimized depends upon the need. Fine. So as a linear function, as a linear function, as a linear function of decision variables. So let us have a relationship between step 1 and step 2. First of all, in step 1 we deal with we prepare or we write down the decision variables. Then we prepare objective function, whether it is to be minimized or maximized, as a linear function of these decision variables. Whereas step 3, to formulate other conditions, that's called as constraints, I will say. To formulate other conditions. Conditions such as resource limitation, then comes next market constraint, then comes interrelations, between variables, etc. So these are all called as restrictions or constraints. Fine. With respect to the linear function. So in step 1 we run the decision variable and we are going to prepare objective function in second step, whether it is to maximize or minimize with respect to these decision variables, and we need to formulate the other conditions. So other conditions means restrictions or constraints such as resource limitations, market constraints, relation between variables. Whereas in step 4, to add non-negative constraints, to add non-negative constraints from the constraints, so that negative constraints of decision variables do not affect the solution. So let me explain this one. To add non-negative constraints. So there are some constraints, they are negative, and in further results they are going to affect the solution. Fine. So that's why we are supposed to add in mathematical formulation of LPP, non-negative constraints adding is very important, so that these negative constraints of decision variable should not affect the solution. Fine. So these are the 4 steps of mathematical formulation of LPP.